And then on the other side, we need to make sure that our scholars have enough access to understand what's on the mind of policy.
And the practical world has challenges that sometimes people who have not dealt with them don't always understand.
So it was unanticipated for me to get involved in the world of diplomacy and foreign affairs.
Hello, welcome to the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy podcast, where we hope to explore diverse topics and welcome guests, including diplomats, experts, and scholars, and try to discuss global challenges and specialized topics in economics, policy, culture, technology, climate change, and more. We are very lucky today to have the Honorable Jim Steinberg, Dean of the Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Steinberg has also served in the U.S. government as Deputy Secretary of State and Deputy National Security Advisor. He has wide experience both in the practice and, of course, in scholarship on diplomacy and national security. So, Jim, welcome to AGDA.
Great pleasure to be here.
Let me just begin by saying that it would be useful for our students and other listeners to hear a bit about your journey from early life to how you ended up and why you chose the field of international relations and how you made the transition from scholar to practitioner and back again.
Well, thank you. It's a great question, and it's one of those stories that I tell my students a lot because it tells you a lot about the unpredictability of career paths. So I grew up in Boston, as you know, and as a young person, I was very much influenced by President Kennedy. For our family, for people there, if you were young in the early 1960s, this was an inspiration. His challenge, to serve the broader good, do something for your country, the creation of the Peace Corps and all of that was a real inspiration. But I came from a fairly modest middle-class family, and so when I started thinking about public policy, I thought about things close to home. And my first jobs in policy and government were actually working for the Boston City Council and the mayor of Boston, and I saw myself working in what we would call the domestic policy field. And so I went into government. I served first in the Carter administration. I worked for Secretary Joseph Califano, who was the Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at the time. But I also, at that time, decided to go to law school and got a law degree. And I went to the Justice Department after working at AGDA. And I was in my office in the Justice Department on the morning of November 4th, 1979. Which is a date which you may remember, maybe many of our listeners won't, which of course was the day that the American diplomats in Iran were taken hostage. And it was early in the morning, early Sunday morning in Washington, and my boss, the Attorney General, had to go over to the White House to help advise the president on what the options were to deal with the hostage taking. And he didn't have time to get all the experts who were not in the office at the time, so he called all of us in who happened to be in the office and said, well, what can I do? What can I advise the president? So we brainstormed a bit. He went over to the White House and came back and he said, well, you're my team now. You're my Justice Department team. They're going to help me deal with this problem. And for the last 15 months of the Carter administration, I spent almost all my time on the hostage negotiations.
If I may interrupt you here, the hostage negotiations were a protracted process, and they were not just a matter for law enforcement or legal issues, but of course involved complex diplomacy as well.
Absolutely.
And so you got introduced to the world of diplomacy by being thrown
exactly
in
right.
at the deep end.
Exactly right. And that's when I first made my acquaintance with my future great boss, Warren Christopher, who was the Deputy Secretary of State at the time and who I accompanied.
And who later on became Secretary of State and was known as a diplomat par excellence.
Absolutely. And my boss when I became head of policy planning at the State Department in the Clinton administration. So it was unanticipated for me to get involved in the world of diplomacy and foreign affairs, but I got the bug. And it seemed to me as an opportunity to have an impact, to engage and to deal with both the diversity of the challenges and the complexity of the world we were living in, and that became my passion and my profession. And from then on, I moved from there to working for Senator Kennedy on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Later went to RAND in California, where I worked as a scholar and a think tanker, and then back into government when President Clinton was elected in 1992.
And of course, that's when you served as Deputy National Security Advisor,
Yep.
and then in the Obama administration as Deputy Secretary of State.
Exactly right.
So in some ways, your involvement with diplomacy came about not from a love of diplomacy per se, but a love of or a desire for public service.
Exactly right.
And so tell us how you feel that diplomacy is an aspect of public service, that this is not just about self-aggrandizement, that this is not just about rising sort of or going up the greasy pole and getting the title of His Excellency when you become ambassador, but you actually can do good.
You know, I think one of the things that we can see in the world that's emerged over the last 5 or 6 decades is the increasing degree of interdependence, and the fact that the problems that we face are problems that no country alone can manage. And so if we're going to deal with the great issues of peace, security, prosperity, climate, global public health, countries need to work together to deal with these problems. And the only way they're going to do it is for people who develop the kinds of skills and knowledge to understand the different perspectives, the different interests, the different histories of the different actors who need to be part of the solution to these global problems. And so diplomacy has, I think, taken on an unusually important role in our world because of the nature of this interdependence, the interconnections, the need for global cooperation to deal with the great challenges of our time. And so it's a difficult problem, but it also is enormously rewarding when you can find ways to bridge the gap, to find ways to overcome differences, and to build structures of cooperation to deal with the things that affect people in their everyday lives.
Now, you and I were talking before we started talking for the podcast about how the world has become more difficult and more complicated and perhaps not as good a place as it was a few years ago. We'll come to that in a bit, but let me ask you before that, the hostage crisis was of course a very big challenge, but there must have been other challenges throughout your career, being National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration at a time when the Soviet Union had collapsed. The world was reorganizing itself. The United States had a unipolar moment. Tell us a bit about how it felt from that moment of feeling kind of helpless when in hostage negotiations you are a bit helpless because you have all these people who are being held against their wishes, against the law. Hostage taking is not lawful, and you're dealing with a regime that is just new and you don't know much about it. And then moving on all the way to the Clinton administration, where you were dealing with a new or laying the foundations of a new global order.
Well, exactly right, and I do think it was an extraordinarily exciting time when President Clinton came into office, because so much of American foreign policy had been dominated since the end of World War II by the challenges of the Cold War and the kind of the constraints that imposed on fresh thinking about foreign policy and what strategies that the United States are to pursue. So once you were liberated from that framework that had so dominated strategic thinking in the United States, there was an opportunity to think afresh, both about how you can organize the world, but also how to meet these new emerging challenges, which had existed even during the Cold War, but had been subsumed within that framework. So issues around trade and investment, issues around the environment are all these issues that were present in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but weren't getting the attention that they deserved. It became possible to begin to think about how do you reorganize international institutions, international cooperation to address these new emerging challenges. And that, I think, was for somebody who's come from both the world of the academy and from the world of practice, it was a chance to put the two together, to think in a strategic sense about these new possibilities which were beginning to open up.
And then came the Obama administration in which you served. And of course, President Obama titled his memoir, audacity of hope, and a lot of people felt very hopeful that the world would be, that President Obama brought a totally new set of eyes to the world. How did you feel during that period?
Well, I think one of the great things about President Obama was that he appreciated the fact that while the United States remained the most powerful actor in the international system, that it wasn't just a question of America sort of deciding for the rest of the world what to do. I think his own personal experiences, his own, where he grew up and his own life experiences made him appreciate the fact that at the end of the day, the United States was not going to be successful unless it found ways to cooperate and understand the perspectives of others. And I think that was a very important thing to bring, a certain degree of humility about the way the United States engages in the rest of the world. And I think in the long term, this is a transition the United States still has to work its way through, that we have a unique role to play because of our power and our history, but also a recognition that we have to find ways to work with others even when there are differences in perspective in others. And I think that was the unique contribution that he made from his own personal experience to help begin to reorient the way the United States was beginning to deal with the rest of the world.
Well, the United States is still the world's single largest military power. And probably that gives it clout around the world. But what you're saying is that alone is not enough to be able to lead the world or even play a leading role in the world. Is it even necessary to try and lead the world?
I do believe that it is necessary because I think, as scholars, we know the problem of collective action, right? Which is that everybody left to their own is going to look to the other fellow to try to solve the problem. We call it free riding in the world of the academy. But it does require a prime mover, somebody who has enough of a stake and enough of a commitment and enough of a capacity to galvanize international cooperation. So it is that balance between having the leadership and the commitment to really bring people together and to make the commitments that are necessary to produce cooperation, but also to recognize you can't just impose it. And I think that's both the great opportunity and the great challenge for the United States, and it remains as important today as it did in the past.
I don't know if you worked under Madeleine Albright, but Madeleine Albright titled her book, The Indispensable Nation, about the United States. Do you see the U.S. as an indispensable nation for the world? And if it is, what does it bring to the table?
I do. And I think, as I said, the reason is because even when countries recognize that there's a necessity of cooperation and working together, that it's very hard to galvanize that action. You need somebody who's out there and saying, we need to make things happen. If you have too many different actors, none of whom have enough of a stake, you just don't get decisions that are made, even though they're necessary to benefit everybody, whether it's on trade, whether it's on global public health, whether it's on dealing with climate. And so I think the United States, both because of our capacity and our history, is the only country that really can provide that galvanizing force. But it has to be done in a way that recognizes that others have a perspective and need to be brought along.
So power, but with humility.
Power with
leadership,
humility.
But with humility.
And an appreciation of the legitimacy of the differences that people have.
And an acknowledgement of the role of others.
Absolutely essential, right? Because I think that even Secretary Albright would say that being the indispensable nation doesn't mean that you can do it by yourself. She was always a great believer in the need for building coalitions, about working with others.
So unilateralism is definitely not what...
and it was certainly not hers and not my view about how
it never has been. And for full disclosure, I must tell those listening to this conversation that I did interact with Jim when he served as Deputy Secretary of State. I served as an ambassador in Washington, D.C., accredited to the government of the United States. So I do have some idea of the process at that time. Diplomacy is a difficult process, though, because it is a process of trying to aggregate various national interests, finding something that everybody can find common interest in. Do you feel that diplomacy is under threat and under challenge right now, with too many actors on the global stage wanting to do their own thing?
It's definitely under challenge, but I think it's more because of some of the underlying social forces that we're seeing, which are very strong sense that populist movements, very nationalistic movements that make it harder for diplomats who understand the need to cooperate, to compromise, to find common ground, to have to deal with their domestic audiences back at home, which are much more focused on their own national particularistic efforts. And that's why, one of the things that I've learned as a diplomat is that you have to learn to deal with your own public as well as to deal with the other diplomats that you're having to deal with, and to deal with the very real problems of developing a domestic consensus in favor of international engagement.
Yeah, and no diplomat can be successful unless he has full backing and support of public opinion in his own country and of the people who hold power in his own country or her own country. Back to academia. How does it feel to be head of the School of Advanced International Studies, which is definitely one of the most significant and important schools for international studies in the United States and possibly the world?
It's a very exciting time to be doing it because the challenges on the international stage now are very different from when I was growing up. We're dealing with a much more complex set of issues and a degree of problems that aren't the sort of traditional things that were taught in the old schools of international affairs. We now have to have diplomats who also understand about climate change, who understand about artificial intelligence and synthetic biology, who understand about the problems of food security and the like. And so what we're having to do is to train a new generation of leaders who have a sophisticated understanding of these very complex, often very technologically sophisticated problems, but also understand the world of politics and the world of international engagement. And so rethinking our curriculum, rethinking about the kind of tools and skills that our students need to have, not just to address today's problems, but the ones 10, 20, 30 years from now, is an exciting time. And to be at a university which is at the cutting edge of so many of these issues in medicine and health, in computer science and material science, all the things that are changing our world, is a great opportunity to help contribute to a more sophisticated, forward-looking thinking about the challenges on the international stage.
Before we close, tell us about being here in Abu Dhabi. What brings you here? And what can you tell us about SAIS's relationship with the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy?
I'm just thrilled about the partnership that we have with the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. This is, this is a place that really reflects a country that is looking into the future, that is dealing with these issues, whether it's the energy transition and climate change, whether it's dealing with the problems of water and food security, whether it's dealing with the kind of the 21st century issues. The UAE has played a really critical role and has positioned itself to be an influential actor on these issues. And so the ability for our diplomats and our future diplomats to work together, for us to exchange ideas as scholars and researchers, but also as teachers, and to do the kinds of exchanges and common programming and that we can do together is something that I find enormously exciting. I know it's going to be of great value to our students and our faculty, and I think the partnerships that we're developing here are going to have a big impact.
How does scholarship and research impact the world of diplomacy? How much do diplomats need the inputs of scholars who research the subjects that diplomats deal with on a day-to-day basis?
I always said when I was a diplomat and when I was in practice that we are desperately in need of good and new and innovative ideas. I mean, we're looking for solutions. How do you get around the stalemates and the boxes that we're in? Where is the innovation going to come from that allows us to solve problems and to think of new ways of doing it? And so I think any good diplomat is constantly on the look for the new, fresh ideas, the creative solutions. And having that partnership and having people who can go back and forth between the academy and practice is really critical if we're going to deal with these immensely complicated challenges that we're facing today.
And if I'm not mistaken, at some point you did write something about the sort of the policy-making world, the relationship between the policy-making world and the world of academia, because there were people who were pointing out how academics are not being heard enough in policy-making and why policymakers tend to ignore academics, and you came up with some ideas on that score. Do you want to share something?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I think that we need to build the channels of communication. And so For example, when I was the head of the policy planning staff at the State Department, we brought in academics to spend time on the policy planning staff so that people could get to know each other, understand where the discourse is. And then we need to have much more interaction at the mid-career level so that people have an opportunity to come back, take some time away from the world of practice to learn what the new fresh thinking is. And then on the other side, we need to make sure that our scholars have enough access to understand what's on the mind of policymakers. So when they think about what their research topic should be, they're not just sort of guessing as to what would be of value, but really understand what's on the mind. What are the problems that the policy world is facing so that their own research can contribute directly to those solutions.
And the practical world has challenges that sometimes people who have not dealt with them don't always understand.
Of course, because there are constraints, you can sit in, if you're only just sitting in your office in a university and you don't understand the real and practical constraints that a diplomat or a political leader have to face, then your solutions aren't going to be very useful.
So looking back at your life, which part of it do you remember with greatest fondness? The part where you were struggling or working in local government, the part where you were training to be a lawyer and being a lawyer, the part where you were a diplomat, or the part where you were a scholar?
It's hard to pick out one because they all contribute to each other. I mean, I have to say, at this stage of my career, I love being in the classroom. I love the opportunity to engage with young people, with their fresh thinking, with their optimism about the future, and the opportunity to try to share some of my own experiences and insights to help them do a better job and perhaps doing a better job in solving the problems that our generation did.
Well, thank you for those insights. Anything else you would like to share, especially with the younger generation, students and would-be students who want to come into the world of diplomacy?
I think the main lesson I would say is that the public service is not easy, and we shouldn't sugarcoat it. Very often, people who are in the world of public service are criticized and their actions are challenged. But the reward is enormous. At the end of the day, when
the reward is not monetary, because you make far more money as a hedge fund manager than you do as a senior diplomat or even as Secretary of State of the United States.
No doubt about it. But the feeling of getting up every day and working for something bigger than yourself, and for not just your time but for future times, is the ultimate reward, and there's nothing better than that.
Jim Steinberg, thank you very much on behalf of the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. This episode is presented by the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. The Academy offers accredited educational and training programs dedicated to preparing future diplomats and leaders in government and also in the private sector. The Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy combines a unique institutional approach with diplomacy, academic programs, and research. You can learn more by visiting our website, www.agda.ac.ae.